Welcome to Wavemaker Conversations. I'm Michael Schulder, and this episode is about climate change. Next week's is as well. Obviously, in the news, there have been stories about the enormous wildfires in France and Spain and Canada and the multiple heat waves in Europe. My guest today is one of the most fascinating people to address this. His name is Spencer Glendon, and he has been driven by a question since he was a young kid growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, a well-to-do area, seeing the poverty in Detroit. He said, my obsession since then has been to find out how prosperity and catastrophe can be so close together. And that has driven his work from Russia to the south side of Chicago to spending 3 years off and on in China. And now it's brought him to the field of climate change. And so given the news of the week, of the past few weeks, this interview from 2022, this is the time to bring it back. This is my conversation with the fascinating, brilliant Spencer Glendon. Spencer Glendon of Probable Futures, I do want to tell you that your work has already transformed how I view my days and sometimes my hours. And right now, when we finish this conversation in a couple of hours, I've got an HVAC guy coming over to our house because one zone of our house, the family room, is not working. And I live in Atlanta, and it's getting hot. And because of the concepts that you have framed for us, I'm thinking, you know what? I'm a nomad right now, moving from one room to the other, except that's easy. And it's not going to be so easy down the road. So you can pick it up from there, but I did notice that one of your creative partners actually used that metaphor of HVAC. We're basically trying to repair the HVAC system of the entire Earth.
I'll tell you about a moment I had when that was very clarifying for me in this work. And we can go back to how I got started on this work. But my wife and I, for a long time, didn't own a car. And we could walk to work where we lived, and we would occasionally rent a car. There was a local rental service around here that we could use easily. And I got into somebody's car, and I hadn't been in a lot of cars. I got into somebody's nice car, and I found that there was a thermostat on both sides of the car. The driver and the passenger could choose their own climate. And I thought, first of all, it's kind of preposterous because they're in such close proximity to each other. But I also thought of two things that related. One is that we become so accustomed to having control over our environment that even moderate differences between people who are sitting right next to each other were to be indulged by machines. Machines were there to indulge us in having slightly different climates, even right next to each other. And the setting on the person's car was that it was 70 degrees for both passenger and driver at the time. And I thought, you know what, a modern person in the developed world, how much of their life do they spend at 70 degrees? And I realized for many of them, within 5 degrees of 70 degrees, it's basically all the time because they live in a world that's got a thermostat in their house, in their car, at their work, in whatever venue they're in. And if it's not a comfortable temperature outside, they don't go outside. When it's around 70 degrees, they enjoy and they indulge and they go outside. And then I started thinking even about very prosperous people in the United States and elsewhere who, when it gets cold in Michigan or Minnesota, they move. They go somewhere where it's around 70 degrees. And this idea of control became really clarifying to me because temperature is actually the measurement of how fast the atoms in the atmosphere are vibrating. And what people are doing is desiring complete control over the atoms around them. They want the world around them to behave in the most pleasant way. And once they've set it at whatever their pleasant way is, they want it that way all the time. And I realized we were exercising this control in a way that was so extreme that it detached us from the physical world. There are all these sensations we were not having, the sensation of cold, the sensation of extreme warmth, that it became harder probably for them to imagine what a really hot day would be like, what a really cold day would be like, that the extremes they were insulated from them. And also just somebody who understands the physical world pretty well, think about how much energy that is to make the atoms around you dance to whatever song you want them to dance to, exactly the tempo, exactly the speed. And I thought, the cost of all this control is just so high. It's so much energy to make that control so complete that in the process of doing this, we're actually modifying the atmosphere. So we're actually making the outside world less hospitable. There are actually fewer nice days. There are fewer in the temperate zones of the world. There are fewer 70-degree days. There are more days that are brutally hot and more days that are sticky or more days that are rainy because of the energy we've trapped in the atmosphere. And so this process of trying to get the atoms around us to behave just the way we want them, we're actually losing control of the system that gave us naturally nice days. And you had this trade-off that I thought, man, this isn't worth it. And I remember just sort of saying, can I roll down the window in the car I was in? Can we just have whatever's outside for a while and feel that?
By the way, what year did this happen, this epiphany?
This would probably be 2014, something like that.
So this is before you took the deep dive into climate, it sounds like.
Yeah, I had just started. What happened? So I started working on climate change in 2012, principally out of curiosity. So I had been working in finance as sort of an odd duck in the financial community, which is to say, I'd never read the Wall Street Journal. I couldn't tell you on a given day where the Dow or interest rates were exactly. They weren't what I was interested in. I was interested in puzzles, and I was interested in how the world had become what it was and what it might become in the future. So part of the reason I'd left academia was I liked working on the future. I liked thinking about what would be. And in academia, there's really only place for studying the past. And I realized that it really wasn't permitted to work on the future if you were in academia, and that finance was a place where you could do that. Now, finance has different rules and different orthodoxies and different norms than academia. What I found is I could use pretty academic and rigorous practices to investigate the world and then say, here's something that's not going to last. Here's something that people have built into their norms or expectations and is likely to break. And so almost everybody in finance uses some kind of model.
Let me pause you for 1 second, because just so we understand where you were, what you were studying in academia, what was your specialty at that time?
So when I was in graduate school, I studied economic history and urban economics. I was interested in how it was that some cities boomed and busted, and why it was that some cities boomed and busted and other cities grew in perpetuity. I grew up around Detroit and was obsessed with how and why terrible things happened in Detroit, while nearby, where I lived in Ann Arbor, there was prosperity. And so how prosperity and catastrophe could be so close together was my obsession. I was actually first an industrial engineer. I thought I would fix Detroit one factory at a time. I worked in an auto plant for Ford Motor Company. And then I spent the years following my undergraduate work trying to understand how different kinds of places work. So I actually learned German and moved to Germany because it was prosperous and made good cars and had a middle class. And then I came back and I worked in the United States on the south side of Chicago in a bank that served a Black community and where I was one of the few non-Black employees. Just trying to understand how I could help, and also how did that place work that was sort of outside of the mainstream economy.
And let me pause you there again, because again, I've seen snippets of your biography, but nobody's ever done a slightly deeper dive into that. But that's fascinating to me. So you came back from Germany, you went to the south side of the Chicago, very poor, predominantly Black neighborhood, in the lending field or in some other field?
I already had a degree in engineering. I had been what's called a Fulbright scholar, but I felt like I needed to learn things that I couldn't be taught in school. And so I took an entry-level job in a bank on the south side of Chicago, basically processing forms for people who wanted to borrow money to open a Domino's pizza or improve the building of their muffler shop. It was commercial lending in a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. And I was helping them organize their paperwork and get prepared to present their loan case to the loan committee. And in the process, I learned what people dreamed of, what they hoped for, also how they perceived the world, and how they understood the financial system. And so it was a great experience. It was a great learning experience. And from there, I was asked to actually run a small business lending program in central Russia, which is a was a real, in you would need some Deus ex machina in a play to make that happen. What really happened was that I worked for a guy who uh, was asked if his bank could run a lending program in Russia, and he should have said no. And instead, he said yes, and then had the problem of finding someone to go do that work. And I worked for really talented Black people who wanted to work in a Black neighborhood, not live in Nizhny Novgorod in the middle of Russia. And instead of saying no to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, my boss said, well, we've got this one kid who's 24 years old, and he might go. And so they asked me, and I said, sure. And so I moved to central Russia at the end of 1993 and ran a small business lending program, built a small business lending program in this city of Nizhny Novgorod, which was very much the kind of thing I wanted to do, was say, here's a place where markets don't work very well. Can we figure out how to create prosperity in this place?
This was just a couple of years after the wall fell, was it? I mean, it was 1993.
Effectively, in that place, it was effectively 2 years later. And so the wall fell in 89. By 91, so this was in the early years of Yeltsin, essentially, that I was there. And the Russian banks had been sort of functional arms of the government, not actual lending institutions. And so I was working with local banks to figure out how they could lend money to small businesses who also had no history. They had no credit rating. They had never operated independently before. And so these bakers and brick makers and accountants and dentists wanted to start their own businesses and had no history of doing that. And so we had to figure out a way to do what I had done in the United States, which is have forms that people would fill out to say, here's what my business is, here's what I hope it becomes, here are my plans, here's my collateral, such as it is, and figure out how to help them make the markets work for them, make markets work for them. So this place called Nizhny Novgorod, which was sort of like the Milwaukee of Russia, if you will. It was about 1 million people. It was somewhat industrial, several hundred kilometers east of Moscow. But it was a lesson for me in how much of modern life in the West was actually conditional on all kinds of institutions already existing. And so here, none of those institutions existed. And so understanding how, I think you've probably heard me in other contexts talk about civilization, how many institutions there were on top of which finance sits. So I had worked in banking, but the purview of banking in the United States is not to figure out why the legal system is the way it is, or why the cultural norms are the way they are, or why the infrastructure is what it is. And in Russia, I had this one guy who was a brick maker. Was his factory made bricks. He said, look, Russia only has 2 problems, according to Gogol. They are fools and bad roads. And you can see that my road is shit. So you only need to decide one thing. There's only one decision for you to make, which is, implicitly whether he was a fool or not. And I realized how much of Russian infrastructure, from the roads to the rules to the laws, was not suited to make this community work in a functional way. And so I actually went back to when I moved back to the United States, I went to graduate school to learn economic history and understand, how did we get here? How did we get to the point that we are in the United States and in Europe and in Japan? What were the institutions along the way? And how much of that is actually permanent, and how much of it is actually, we assume it, but it could go away. It's based on a set of assumptions. And so when I finished graduate school, I had offers to become a professor and offers to work in finance. And I wasn't particularly interested in money, but I also wasn't particularly interested in just mining the past for patterns. And so when I went to work in finance, I was very fortunate to be given essentially permission to work on open-ended topics. Both my employer and I took my hiring as kind of a lark. Like, let's see. I was fully prepared to be unemployed in 18 months.
By the way, who was this employer?
This company called Wellington Management.
So this is when you started. And I know about your association with Wellington. So this was in the early 90s then, right after
This is
Russia.
in 1999 when I started. And they hired me in 1999 because the Asian financial crisis had just happened. And in the Asian financial crisis, they hadn't done particularly well. And the people they had as in-house experts on Asia had not guided them in successful ways. And frankly, Wellington was a very American firm that had started to have a presence globally and didn't understand the rest of the world very, very well, and asked me effectively, could you figure out what we might do in Asia? What should we do in Asia? And so I was asked to cover, as it's called, Asia ex-Japan, which is everything from Indonesia to Korea. So there were 9 countries. And after a short period of time, I went to my boss, and after touring Asia and looking around saying, there's no way I can do this job. Like, nobody should be asked to do this job. But I think I can figure out China. And at that time, in 1999, China was pretty insignificant financially. It wasn't a very big economy. There was nothing to buy or sell. But this is relevant for why I wound up doing the work I did later, which was, I said, because nobody works on it, actually, there are very few informed people about it. No one spends time investigating it very much. And I think I might be able to figure it out. And if I figure it out, there's some chance that it's a big deal. And so I spent sort of the 1999, 2000, 2001, spending a lot of time in China. I happened to speak okay Chinese because I learned Chinese so I could talk to my wife's parents. But understanding what was changing in China, what was possible in China. And I wound up with recommendations and insights about how commodity markets would change globally, about how interest rates would change globally, about how wages would change globally. In fact, the middle class that I was so interested in preserving and helping in the United States, I saw as being terribly at risk because there were 300 million Chinese people who were about to enter the labor force who were all high school educated and who had a wage that was less than $1,000 a year at the time. But so I came up with this realization that has carried me since 2000, really, that academia and most industries are divided into small pieces. And those small pieces are pretty orthodox. So if you went to Wellington or Goldman Sachs or Deutsche Bank or HSBC or even an exotic hedge fund, the slices, there would be somebody who did autos, there'd be somebody who did transport, there'd be somebody who did steel, somebody who did oil. Those slices would be pretty much the same everywhere. And the same is true in academia, which is that there are these disciplines that are very finely defined. And as a species, we have divided the world up into pieces, had people become expert in these pieces. And in aggregate, I would say we as a species know a lot more. But individually, we actually know very little. We have our own domains. And what I realized was there are topics that cross domains and nobody works on them. Like literally nobody works on them in finance or in other things. And that was true of China. China had the potential to be big, but because there was nothing to buy or sell, nobody worked on it. And I wound up with this view that actually it would change lots of things. And that turned out to be very fruitful for the investment community. And so I developed a practice over the years of finding other topics that nobody worked on in finance because they just weren't well defined or they were too broad.
But clarify for me or be more specific about what is it that you were able to intermingle in your analysis of China that ended up producing successful investments?
Sure. So a couple of things. So the first was understanding that actually the Chinese had an enormous infrastructure that already was extremely productive, and they were likely to build a lot more of it. So it was a physical infrastructure that connected the country, but also sort of a cultural infrastructure. It was all one language. There were other things about it. But also that the communist government had done an amazing job of educating everybody through high school. So actually literacy rates in China were higher than the United States, despite the fact that the difference in per capita income was sort of 40 to 1. And so you had this group of people who were moderately skilled and could be trained to do lots of things, who had wages of less than $1,000. And I realized that there were more of them than there were actual workers in industrial workers in Europe, for example. It was and that never before in history had that many people entered the labor market in a very short period of time.
Mm.
So what a lot of people knew was that there had been the one-child policy in China. Well, the reason for the one-child policy is there were so many children. They had had this enormous number of children in a very short period of time. And that group of people, they educated quite well, and they were all entering the labor force at the same time. And the government said, we need to find ways to keep these people busy. We need to find ways to keep these people occupied. That's why we will open up the markets, labor markets in particular, for them to work. And so what I did was go around the country to actually 24 different provinces to see where these, in every place, was there this activity? Was there the building of cities? Was there the building of industry? Were there, schools, new universities? And the answer was that the path towards economic development was being paved by the government in ways that were quite orthodox already in the West. And people might have been dismissive of China because it was communist, or dismissive of China because it was exotic, or because it was closed, or because they just had no familiarity. But what I could see was actually the path to being a middle income country is pretty well paved by precedent. And they were literally paving their country to make that happen. And so what I came away thinking was, for example, the price of commodities globally will go up because the Chinese will buy so much oil and gas and cement and other things, but the price of labor will go down because there'll be so many new workers. And so in the past, if you invested in commodities, commodities were a precursor to inflation. If oil went up, inflation would go up. And I had the view that actually there would be times when oil would go up a lot and inflation would go down because wages globally would go down as a result. So we'd have no inflation. And the other thing about it was that a view that the Chinese would actually wind up saving an enormous amount of money, that the pace of their income growth would be quite dramatic, and they would be unlikely to spend at the same pace they were earning. And so they would wind up with this huge amount of savings.
Was that an insight you got from just understanding and living with the culture, or was it something else?
It was mostly that, which mostly just that. So I actually spent some time, this may interest you, I spent some time I realized how quickly wages were rising in China. So the average person's wage was going up almost 20% a year. And I tried to figure out where in history had that happened before. And the answer is not very many places. And in the places where it happened in the past, so San Francisco during both of its big booms, Chicago in the early part of the 20th century, norms would change very quickly because nobody knew how to live. If your income is growing 20% a year, every 3.5 years, you have twice as much income. There's something called the rule of 72, which is that if you take something that's compounding, you divide the rate of compounding into 72 and you get how many years it takes to double. So something that's growing at 72% compounding actually doubles every year. And so I realized people's incomes are growing now here. Every 3.5 years, they're doubling. They don't know what to buy. They don't know how to spend that money. And so you wind up with a high savings rate because there's all this basically surprise earnings. This is a group of people who had never had incomes go up, and now they had this surprise. The second insight is one that I'm happy to share. I've never talked about in this way before, but there were some very good economists who worked on China, and all of them had roughly the same forecast. And this gets to the rule of 72 in a second. So their forecast was that China would grow about 8% a year in GDP terms. And then that also there would be some amount of currency appreciation and there'd be some amount of inflation. Well, at the time, Japan had an economy of $4 trillion and China of $1 trillion. So Japan was 4 times as large as China. And Japan was not growing. And I was really puzzled because it seemed to me that China would be extremely dynamic, but nobody else who worked on China seemed particularly interested in it. And so I invited the economists from all of these institutions to come to see me. And I surveyed them in the following way. I said, can you tell me, first question was, when will China be bigger than Japan in dollar terms, in GDP terms? And the lowest answer was 22 years. Most people said 25. And I said, okay, can you tell me your expectations for Japanese growth? The answer was 0 GDP growth, 0 currency growth, and 0 inflation. So Japan will stay at 4%, at $4 trillion, basically in perpetuity. They've proven to basically be right about that. Okay, that was the accurate forecast. I said, can you tell me how China will grow? They said, well, it'll be 8% GDP growth. I said, okay, what about currency? Well, the currency will probably appreciate about 3%. What about inflation? We think there'll be about 3% inflation. Well, if you add those numbers up, you get 14. And so I said, well, we're talking about something here that's around 15%. So that would double every 5 years. And they said, yeah. I said, well, okay, so China's at $1 trillion. We double in 5 years, it's 2. We double in 5 more years, it's 4. So by your math, China will be the size of Japan in 10 years. And they said, well, that's impossible. And I said, well, I don't know what we're arguing about here. And the real thing was just, it was hard to imagine that China could get 4 times bigger in 10 years. It was hard to conceive of the idea that Japan, which had been the second most important place in the world, would be quickly relegated to third or fourth most important place. And so there were times where I'd say, I'm not sure, are we arguing about how math works? Are we arguing about arithmetic? Because it seems to me that your own numbers, which have mostly proven to be right, but the insight from it was one they were just reluctant to embrace. They couldn't imagine a world where China was vastly more important than Japan very, very quickly. And that's exactly what happened.
So listen, that phrase, they could not imagine, gets right to your work today. And I don't want to short circuit the transition, because I'd really love to know, how much money were you able to make your firm by this insight that China was going to grow a lot faster than anybody else imagined? But just, if you can tell me anything about that, I'd be fascinated. And then we can move to how you are trying to help us imagine the future based on the numbers and the physics that you are drawing from in science.
So I'll answer your question in 2 ways about the impact of my work. I was very fortunate to work in a place where people really listened to what I had to say, and also where I had a lot of contact with clients, and our clients were mostly big pension funds. And so the big pension funds, I developed strong relationships with a lot of the clients, because for the big pension funds, they would say, well, this seems like a really big deal. We need to do something at scale to consider this. But within the firm, all of the investors were divided into those little slices. And those slices were almost always tied to a benchmark. And that benchmark was very rigorous, in the sense that if you were the portfolio manager for, I'll call it mid-cap growth stocks, well, there's an index, and you needed to be close to that index all the time. So your degrees of freedom of what you could invest in were very few, actually. And so you'd get a big idea from somebody else. There wasn't a lot you could do with that big idea. And so what happened was, I think some of the insights were distributed around the firm in ways that added marginally, but it was a case where sort of what I would call an inframarginal insight, a big change, was actually very hard to incorporate. And we see this now. I'll jump ahead a little bit. I'll go back in a minute, but with climate change, which is everybody thinks in their domain it will be small. If you back up enough, people will acknowledge, boy, the people will say simultaneously, the world is coming to an end and it's not that big a deal for my discipline. And that mindset that, well, where I live, what I work on, my domain is narrow, means that actually big things have a hard time getting in. And so it was more at sort of the policy level where people might engage. What I was very fortunate about was that my firm embraced my ability to think through things like this and asked me to help other people with their own research processes. So I oversaw other people's research, helped them with other research, became the director of research for the firm. And there, what I tried to do was just help people understand which of their models, their heuristics, I would call them, their rules of thumb, maybe could be interrogated a little bit better to figure out, is this just a pattern from the past that you observe and don't know why it will continue into the future? Or do you have a way of seeing the future that says, here's something that's we know with high conviction about the future? Does it comport with that? Does your model, does your framework comport with something we actually know about the future? And so I developed a practice of having a small sort of laboratory that I ran by myself of investigating questions that other people thought, well, that's probably not tractable, or that's just not relevant, or it's outside. And once in a while, I'd find something that turned out to be highly tractable and insightful and useful. So in the way that I was assigned China. I found it. I didn't find it on my own, but when I discovered it, I realized it was outside of the conversation and could be brought in a productive way. I started looking for other things like that. And it was in that spirit that I started working on climate change, which was, this is a thing that if it's big, it's really big, but I never hear anybody talk about it in finance. And even if it were a big thing, I don't know who would work on it. And so I started working on it. And the way I started working on it was a different kind of fundamental work than the China work, which was walking around, talking to people and reading about finding analogous places, even if those analogies were somewhat tenuous. And so what I did first was read journal articles from the 70s and 80s by scientists about climate change. And what I discovered was those models offered forecasts of how the climate would change that were incredibly prescient. And I was working in an environment where if you were right 60% of the time and didn't even know why, you could get fabulously rich. Whereas these scientists had laid out an explanation for how a system worked. And the system had worked exactly as they had foretold, and nobody was using it. And so actually when I started working on climate change, I didn't tell anybody I was doing it. And my first communication with my firm was a year after I had started this work. And I sent out an email called, just the subject line was unused models. And I started it out saying, I have a set of models that have been extremely predictive, and they tell us a lot about what's coming over the next 30 years. Let me show you some graphs. And I showed graphs of the forecast of temperature rise with the subsequent data, forecast of sea level rise, ice coverage, but I stripped off the labeling. All you could see were the numbers. And then I said, do you want these models? And people were like, yes, these are so much better than my bond model. This is so much better than my interest rate carry model, my currency model. This is so much better than my PE to growth model. Yes, what are these models? I said, great, they're climate change models. And we should be using them because they're extremely robust. They've done very well, and they tell us a lot about what's coming. And some people were excited to learn about that. And lots of people were like, well, that's a dirty trick. And I said, I don't understand how it's a dirty trick. I'm giving you better information about the future. And in finance, that's what you should want. In fact, in life, it's it would generally be nice to be able to anticipate things. And so I realized that there were these models that were predictive. And then I started working backwards. I started learning about how, in the same way I had been curious, how did industrialization and urbanization happen? How did we get to this point? And that's the biggest discovery for me that I wish were more publicly known, which is that the Earth's climate was unstable until 10,000 years ago, at which point it stabilized in this period scientists call the Holocene. But basically starting 10,000 BCE, so 12,000 years ago, starting 10,000 BCE, the climate stabilized at this level that was just perfect for humans. Nowhere on Earth was too hot for us. So we're both big mammals. We need to offload heat. If we are in an environment that is 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees centigrade, so 35 degrees centigrade or 95 Fahrenheit and 100% humidity, you and I would die very shortly in that environment because we could not cool. We would overheat. So that's the ceiling on human habitability. And from 10,000 BCE to now, it was never that temperature. It was just below at the hottest places. So the hottest places you've been, you're in Atlanta on the worst summer day, you're still well clear of that, well short of that level. If you're in the shade, you have a drink, you're hydrated, you're okay if you're healthy. And so there was this stability over 10,000 years. And I realized that stability makes everything else easier. That stability is probably the handmaiden to complexity, to this civilization we have that's so robust. And I actually was meeting with a climate scientist named Ken Caldera at Stanford at the time. And I asked him, I said, it seems to me like civilization started. Settlements, the first settlements are around 9,500 BC, that civilization is built because we have a stable climate. And he said, yeah, everybody knows that. And I was like, nobody knows that. Absolutely nobody knows that. And I racked my brain and remembered in probably 7th or 8th grade, I had taken an earth science class where we'd been told that magically around the world, around the same time, different communities started agriculture. Nobody knew, how did they tell each other? How did they know? Well, what happened was for a few hundred years, they had stability. And they're like, this seems like it's going to last. Let's plant some things. And so humans, the first humans like us came around about 200,000 years ago. They were nomads for 190,000 years because the climate was never stable. And so that was very powerful for me, not just in a investment setting in context, but in any context, to know stability is the reason. So I'm looking at you at me in our respective houses. Our houses are built for a particular climate, yours for one climate, mine for another. The road outside your house, the road outside mine is built for a particular climate. The storm sewer in your town and mine are engineered for a specific climate. And they're all based on the idea that what happened in the past is what will happen in the future. And we can make these assumptions about the models of make us what I would call, we would have a model in mind. And that model is, we can look backwards and implicitly use that to look forwards. Well, if you can do that, then lots of the concerns that our earliest ancestors had go away. You can anticipate the future. Well, we can start planning. And what is finance but planning? Planning is having expectations for the future, building for the future. And what I realized was, okay, none of my colleagues are thinking about the climate underpinning everything they do. And this thing that is most fundamental to civilization is changing. And nobody's paying attention. And if I think about all the models that will go haywire, I mean, the models of what would happen to oil prices had to change to incorporate China. That's pretty minor compared to the models that are all around us, implicit and explicit, that will change when this perfectly stable thing becomes unstable. And when the bounds that we lived in start being broken. And so I started realizing this is not a narrow problem. This is not a specialist problem. This is a problem of how we conceive of the world. This is not a narrow insight. This is a framework that I completely lacked, and the people around me seemed to lack. And so I started working from then on almost exclusively on how do I understand the climate myself, how much of that can be shared and translated with others, and then how can we work together to change the way people consider the world they live in so that we appreciate the value of this stability and prepare for the instability that's already baked into the system. And so that's what I started doing starting in 2014 or so.
And did you capture the imaginations of your fellow investors? You know, it's interesting. I looked at the Wellington side, and I know Wellington has been doing a lot of work, and that you've generated a lot of work there to sort of try to bake climate into assessments. On their website, it's very interesting. They had a little video on what they call the morning meeting. And being a journalist and having been in network television for most of my career, we had a morning meeting. And in that morning meeting, it was, here are the stories of today and only today. And then there would be futures meetings, and those would be, here's what we're working on over the next week, over the next few weeks, over the next few months. It didn't extend beyond that. And I'm thinking, well, there's some parallel there to the morning meetings. And were you able to bake this in? I was fascinated because at Wellington, and I'm sure there are other firms who do things like this, there was this idea which I found fascinating that they have people from different disciplines lead the morning meeting. And I was sort of trying to see the parallel between that and network news. And when I was at CNN for many years, we had an environment unit, but in some ways it was siloed. And in fact, I've been looking at the headlines over the past few days. I've identified a lot of really important climate change stories, ecosystem stories. It's in a separate category. And I just wonder, like right now, you can take this anywhere you want, but I was thinking, boy, I wonder how Spencer Glendon reads the economic headlines from this week, which are all focused on the impact that inflation may have, the impact that, supply chain issues may have. But you're looking at it through a specific set of lenses. And I don't see the word climate in any of these urgent economic stories. And I'm not sure, I feel like shouting to you, get me rewrite. Is there any way that you could burn that into a story so that it becomes second nature to say, when we discuss the economy and how it might impact lives, we can also talk about climate? Or is that is that too far out?
So I don't think it's too far out. And your comparison is quite accurate. The the importance of immediacy is the value, put differently, the ability of people to focus on the immediate is almost infinite, and the ability of people to focus on and step back to see the longer term is much harder. And I partly left Wellington because I didn't think I could make much of a difference there. And but I set up and worked with other people to create partnerships between Wellington and scientists at the Woodwell Climate Research Center that I hoped would over time affect the culture and the practices at Wellington, which it seems to have done. And I'm not close to what they do now, but they have a robust partnership and they are actively working to make climate part of their work. I still think that the challenges of something called modern portfolio theory are quite substantial. So modern portfolio theory comes from an academic environment that looked back at finance over the course of the 20th century, essentially, and said the best strategy is complete diversification. So what you should own is a little bit of everything. And so the owning of a little bit of everything is complete in index funds, for example. That's the idea behind the index funds. But even in a place like Wellington or Goldman Sachs or Fidelity or whatever, there's almost always a benchmark. That benchmark is a way of forcing a kind of portfolio distribution. And the idea is we still want to be exposed to everything, but at the highest level, if you take the pension funds, for example, that I spent time with, they are mostly obsessed with owning a bit of everything. And when I started working with them on climate change, this was the biggest problem for them was, well, we already have this framework where we need to be fully diversified. And I would say, well, okay, let's take oil as an example. Oil is a big part of your benchmark, and you're compelling yourself to own it. You're saying if it's 8% of the stock market, we have to own 8% of it, maybe plus or minus a little bit. I said, let's take oil as an example. It's extremely likely that oil will go to zero over time. There just won't be an oil market at some point in the future. And oil is very volatile. So you have now one asset class that's in this group that is both volatile and will go to zero. Why would you commit yourself to owning it? Why would you force yourself at all times to own it? And they said, well, we have this theory, this modern portfolio theory. We can't walk away from it. It's the framework we use to see the world. And I said, well, then you're going to ride that index all the way down to zero. You're going to wind up at zero passively along the way. And what I came across was pretty widely, and this gets at your point about journalism, is why I bring it up in this context, is that there are narrow decisions that can be made within each domain, and those domains are well defined. But big strategic decisions about how we conceive of the world or how we orient ourselves towards the future, we don't really have a way to do that. And I have a reason why I think that's true, which is that basically, if you're at a place like Wellington or at a place like CNN at the time when you were there, nothing really bad has happened. And so your scope of like, what's a bad outcome? Well, it's like a bear market, or it's a recession, or maybe it's a little round of layoffs. But if you've not experienced terrible things happening, if the bounds of your imagination are, well, there's like a bull market and a bear market, not there's a Great Depression, or there's a war, or there's a plague, or there is, some sort of catastrophe, then the scope of debate narrows enormously. I was in a small meeting with Hank Paulson, who was Treasury Secretary and Chairman of Goldman Sachs, say climate change could be as bad as the 2008 recession. And I said to him, well, that's just the limits of your imagination. That's just the worst thing that happened to you. You've defined the bounds so narrowly that your only frame of reference is this thing that wasn't nearly that bad. And when I read Ray Dalio, who's the director of Bridgewater, you read one of his books, you would think that the 2011 European banking crisis was like an outbreak of cholera, or was, Mount Pinatubo going off or something. Most people by 2015, even in finance, couldn't remember that passage. But for him, that was like a really dramatic environment. And so for all these things, I remember this meeting I went to when I was in graduate school, hosted by John Kenneth Galbraith, an old economist who had been very kind to me, actually. And he gave this talk, and he stood up at the front of the room, and I was the only economist to go. All the other economists at Harvard had thought he was sort of washed up and not relevant because he wasn't modern. He didn't use math in the same way. He wasn't sophisticated. And he stood up at the front of the room, and he held up his hand as if he were holding a book. And he said, I want you to imagine that I'm holding a history book. And I want you to think about the distribution of pages. Because in a history book, there are long periods of time when nothing happens. And so there are only a few pages. And then there are short periods of time when huge things happen, and they have lots of pages. And he said, we're living through a period where nothing's really happening. And what we've built is an economics discipline and a financial discipline that's trying to exploit small changes in this period that's extremely quiescent, extremely placid. And what happens when you have something cataclysmic happens is economists say, well, we can't predict that. There's nothing we can do about that. That's the war, or that's this other thing. And so it's true. If you look at the academic economics, it's all, well, you take out World War II, or you take out the Depression. You take out these things that really mattered. You just focus on the times when, in Galbraith's terms, nothing happened. So I was working in the 2000s. So we'd had one financial crisis, and there had been no inflation since the 70s. Nobody had experienced something terrible happening. And so the imagination for something terrible to happen was just so limited, absolutely limited.
So now this gets to your current work. And I have to say, I've got this book on my desk. So that was part one of my conversation with Spencer Glendon. Part two next week is going to be all about climate change, or almost all about climate change, because towards the end of next week's episode, we're going to hear him talk about some of the most dramatic health challenges I've ever heard anybody face, and what he's learned about life from that, and how he has really become the resilient person he is, which has lessons for how we deal with climate change. So please join Wavemaker Conversations next week, wherever you got this one. I'm Michael Scholder. Thank you for joining me.